Imagine standing frozen in a thunderstorm as a 500-pound African lion charges straight at you. 500 pounds of muscle, teeth, and fury moving at 30 miles per hour. The crowd is screaming, the security team is raising their rifles, and everyone is running for their lives. Everyone except one 74-year-old grandmother. She doesn't run. She doesn't scream. Instead, she steps forward and does something that silenced the entire world. You are not going to believe the secret history that connects this frail woman to the zoo's deadliest predator. And you certainly won't believe how this standoff ends. But before we dive into this heart-pounding story, please do us a massive favor and hit that like button and subscribe button right now. It really helps us out to bring this incredible lion stories to more people. So if you are ready, let's go to Oakhaven. The heat that afternoon at Oakhaven Zoological Gardens was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight. A suffocating blanket of humidity that pressed the air from your lungs and made the horizon shimmer with a watery, indistinct haze. It was the kind of oppressive, heavy atmosphere that usually heralded a violent storm, the sky turning a bruised shade of purple-gray above the tree line, threatening a deluge that refused to break. The air smelled of hot asphalt, popcorn, and the faint underlying musk of captive animals, a scent that was both wild and strangely sterile. Clara Jones sat on a peeling green bench near the Great Cat Ravine, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her walnut cane. At 74, Clara felt the weather in her joints, a deep, grinding ache in her right hip, and a stiffness in her fingers that made gripping a teacup difficult, but she also felt it in her instincts. She had spent 40 years of her life listening to the wild, tuning her frequency to the subtle shifts in barometric pressure and animal behavior that most humans had long ago forgotten how to sense. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes fixed on the enclosure before her. To the casual Saturday crowd, families with sticky-faced children eating melting ice cream, teenagers taking selfies, tourists fanning themselves with park maps, the lion in the enclosure was just a spectacle. A sleeping giant. A bored beast. They saw a photo opportunity, a box to check on their weekend itinerary. But Clara saw what they missed. She saw the way Barnaby, the zoo's 500-pound African male lion, was not sleeping, but waiting. His massive, amber eyes were open, staring unblinkingly at the heavy steel service gate at the rear of his habitat. His tail, usually a lazy pendulum, was twitching with a sharp, agitated rhythm. Thump, thump, pause. Thump, thump, pause. He was pacing a tight figure-8 pattern near the moat, his head low, his shoulders rolling with a tension that spoke of coiled springs ready to snap. "You feel it too, don't you, old boy?" Clara whispered to herself, the words lost in the sticky air. She knew that look. It wasn't aggression exactly. It was distress. It was the look of a creature separated from something vital. It triggered a memory so sharp it made her breath catch. The memory of Arthur, her late husband, pacing the hospital corridor the night they lost their first rescue center to a brush fire. That same helplessness, that same contained fury. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the zoo wash over her. But in her mind, she wasn't in a mid-sized city in England. She was back in the Tsavo region of Kenya. She could smell the red dust, taste the metallic tang of the water from the borehole, and feel the dry, relentless heat of the savannah. She had been someone else then. Not the crazy cat lady the local kids whispered about, and not the invisible widow she had become since Arthur passed away 2 years ago. In Kenya, she had been a guardian, a mother to the motherless, a woman who commanded respect not with a loud voice, but with a quiet presence that even the predators acknowledged. Since returning to England, silence had become her roommate. The house was too big, filled with books Arthur would never read again, and photos of a life that felt like a dream. Coming to the zoo was her pilgrimage. It was the only place the silence didn't feel so loud. She opened her eyes and looked at Barnaby again. There was something about the set of his ears, the specific scar that jagged across his nose like a lightning bolt, that pulled at a thread in her memory she had thought long severed. She had been coming to Oakhaven every day for 3 weeks, ever since she saw a promotional photo of their new star attraction in the local paper. The caption said he was 15 years old, a transfer from a defunct park in Eastern Europe. But the eyes were familiar. They held a specific intelligence, a soulful depth that she had only seen in one other lion, years ago. Inside the glass-walled administration building that overlooked the main plaza, the air conditioning was humming, but it did little to cool the temper of Mark Evans. The director of Oakhaven was a man who wore suits that were too expensive for his salary and too tight for his frame, a man who measured success in quarterly projections rather than animal welfare. He stood by the window, looking down at the swelling crowds with a calculator in his mind, tallying ticket sales against the looming debt of the facility. "Mr. Evans, please, you have to listen to me." Mark turned, his lip curling in irritation. Josh Reed, the senior keeper, stood in the doorway, wringing a baseball cap in his hands. Josh was young, dedicated, and perpetually exhausted. His uniform was stained with grass and mud, a stark contrast to Mark's pristine navy blazer. Josh had the look of a man who hadn't slept in days, his eyes rimmed with red, his hands rough from labor. "I am listening, Josh," Mark said, checking his watch. "I'm listening to you complain about the same thing you complained about on Tuesday and last Friday. It's becoming a boring song, Josh." "It's not complaining, sir. It's the hydraulic latch on Sector 4, the main gate for the lion enclosure," Josh said, his voice rising in desperation. He took a step into the office, ignoring the invisible barrier of authority Mark tried to project. "The corrosion is worse than we thought. The humidity today. The metal is expanding. I heard the solenoid clicking this morning. If the storm hits, if there's a vibration or a power surge, we have backups." Mark dismissed him, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. He turned back to the window, watching the revenue stream walk through the turnstiles. "The backups are manual, sir. If the hydraulics fail, the gate pops to the neutral position. It opens. We need to move Barnaby to the holding pens immediately and weld it shut." Mark laughed, a sharp, humorless bark that chilled the room. "Move him? On a Saturday? In July? Do you have any idea what the gate receipts are today? We are finally in the black, Josh. Finally. I am not closing the main attraction because you're paranoid about a little rust. The board is watching these numbers. I am watching these numbers." "It's not a little rust," Josh insisted, his voice trembling with the weight of his moral obligation. "It's negligence. If something happens, if that animal gets out, or if he gets hurt." Mark spun around, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He walked up to the young keeper, invading his personal space, smelling of expensive cologne and stale coffee. "If you mention that word again, negligence, you're done. And don't think you'll get a reference. I know about your mother's care facility bills, Josh. I know how much you need this paycheck. So you will go back out there, you will put on a smile, and you will let the people see the lion. Do we understand each other?" Josh swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. He thought of his mother, bedridden and dependent on him. He felt the bile of shame rise in his throat. He looked at the floor, defeated. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get out, and make sure the gift shop is fully stocked." Outside, the sky finally bruised over completely. The wind picked up, whipping wrapper papers across the pavement and rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees with a sound like rushing water. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes, the humidity condensing into a heavy, wet anticipation. Clara felt the pressure drop in her ears, a popping sensation. She gripped her cane tighter, her knuckles aching. She watched Barnaby stop his pacing. The lion lifted his head, sniffing the wind, his nostrils flaring wide. He let out a sound that wasn't a roar. It was a low, resonant rumble that started deep in his chest and vibrated through the concrete, through the soles of Clara's sensible shoes and into her very bones. It was a contact call, a sound lions made to locate the rest of their pride across the vast distances of the Serengeti. It was a sound of inquiry. "Where are you? I am here." "Who are you calling?" Clara murmured, leaning forward, her heart aching for him. "You're the only one out there." Then, the sky cracked open. It wasn't just thunder. It was an explosion of sound, a sonic boom that rattled the teeth and shook the fillings. A bolt of lightning forked down, striking a transformer on the utility pole at the edge of the zoo grounds with a blinding flash of blue-white light. Sparks showered down like fireworks. Simultaneously, the ground shook. Inside the enclosure, the hydraulic system that Josh had warned about gave a groan. The sudden power fluctuation sent a confused signal to the corroded solenoid. The pressure released. The metal screamed, a high-pitched shriek of tearing rust and steel that rivaled the thunder. The heavy service gate at the back of the enclosure didn't just unlock, it swung wide open, revealing the dark, inviting corridor of the service area beyond. Barnaby didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the trees. He turned toward the opening, driven by a panic and a purpose that overrode years of captivity. He lowered his shoulder, his muscles bunching, and charged through the gap. The alarm didn't sound immediately. For 10 seconds, there was only the sound of the rain beginning to fall in heavy, fat drops that hissed against the hot pavement. Then, a woman near the enclosure screamed. It was a primal, piercing shriek that cut through the humidity like a knife. "He's out! The lion is out!" Chaos, absolute and terrifying, erupted. The herd instinct of the crowd took over. Hundreds of people turned and ran, a stampede of color and noise. Strollers were overturned, their wheels spinning in the air. Children were snatched up into arms, wailing in confusion. The air filled with a cacophony of panic, shouts, crying, the thud of running feet, the crash of dropped bags. The code red siren finally began to wail, a mournful, rising tone that layered over the screams, turning the zoo into a nightmare soundscape. Barnaby stepped out from the service area and onto the main guest promenade. He was enormous. Without the separation of the moat and the glass, his size was incomprehensible, a 500-pound engine of muscle and tooth. His mane was thick and dark, matted with the sudden rain. He whipped his head side to side, confused by the screaming mass of humanity, his claws clicking on the asphalt. He opened his mouth and roared. It wasn't the Hollywood roar. It was a guttural, terrifying blast of noise that hit the crowd like a physical wave, freezing the stragglers in their tracks before sending them scrambling even faster. It was a warning. Back off. The promenade cleared in seconds. The security guards, young and ill-equipped, were shouting into their radios, retreating to the perimeter to wait for the tactical team. The plaza was empty. Except for one person, Clara Jones stood 20 yards away from the beast. The crowd had flowed around her like a river around a stone. She hadn't moved. She couldn't run if she wanted to. Her hip had seized up with the sudden drop in pressure. But more importantly, she didn't want to. She felt a strange calmness descend upon her, a clarity that she hadn't felt since her days in the bush. "Lady, move! Run!" a security guard screamed from behind a kiosk, his face pale as milk. Clara ignored him. She watched the lion. He was panting, his sides heaving. He wasn't hunting. His tail was tucked low. He was terrified. The rain began to pour in earnest now, a deluge that plastered Clara's gray hair to her skull and soaked her cardigan instantly. She looked small, frail, a leaf in a hurricane. Barnaby saw her. He froze, his head lowered, his ears pinning back against his skull. He let out a huff of breath, his golden eyes locking onto her. He took a step forward, then another, picking up speed. He was charging. The security guard fumbled for the radio on his belt, his hands shaking too much to press the button. "He's going to kill her! Look away!" Clara dropped her cane. It clattered to the wet pavement. She stood as tall as her curved spine would allow. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She breathed in, centering herself. As the massive predator closed the distance, 30 feet, 20 feet, 10, Clara slowly raised her right hand. She didn't hold it up like a stop sign. She held it palm open, fingers slightly curled, chest height, and then she made a sound. It was a sharp, rhythmic noise, made deep in the throat. Ha 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 ha. It was the sound of a lioness greeting her cub. Barnaby skidded. His massive paws slid on the wet asphalt, his claws screeching for purchase. He came to a halt just 4 feet from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the musk of his wet fur and the raw meat on his breath. The crowd, watching from the safety of the gift shop windows and the distant walkways, went silent. Phones were pressed against glass, recording. They expected blood. They expected horror. Barnaby didn't strike. He stretched his neck out, his massive nose twitching. He inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of rain and lavender soap. and something older, the scent of a memory buried deep in his DNA. Clara's hand trembled, not from fear, but from an overwhelming rush of emotion. She looked into the amber eyes, seeing the confusion dissolve into recognition. "I knew it," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I knew it was you." She didn't call him Barnaby. She spoke the name she had given him 15 years ago, under the shade of an acacia tree, in a sanctuary that no longer existed. "Hello, Solomon." The lion blinked. He let out a soft, chuffing breath, his whiskers twitching. The silence on the promenade was fragile, held together only by the shock of the onlookers. The rain hammered down, creating a misty curtain around the woman and the beast. For Clara, however, the world had narrowed down to a single point of connection. The past crashed into the present with the force of the thunder overhead. She wasn't at Oak Haven anymore. She was 59 years old again, her hands covered in dirt, kneeling in the red dust of the Savo East Sanctuary. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent oranges and pinks. In her lap lay a bundle of tawny fur, a creature that was more ribs and teeth than lion. He was a starving, dehydrated cub whose mother had been killed by poachers for a few dollars, worth of skin and bone. She held a bottle of goat's milk, warm and sweet, trying to coax him to drink. He had hissed at her then, fearful and wild, swiping with claws that were already sharp enough to draw blood. She hadn't pulled away. She had hummed to him, a low, vibration, heavy tune she learned from the local Maasai herdsman. A song of safety, of nightfall, of peace. It took 3 days of sitting in the dust, humming until her throat was raw, but eventually he had crawled into her lap. He had pressed his small, rough head against her hand and begun to suckle. She had named him Solomon for the wisdom he showed in knowing who to trust. They had spent 3 years together before the trouble began. He grew from a scrap of fur into a magnificent adolescent male. He would walk with her along the perimeter fence, chuffing at her heels. But then came the political unrest. The sanctuary was seized, the land repurposed for mining rights. The animals were crated up and sold off to the highest bidders, zoos, private collectors, hunting ranches. Clara and Arthur had fought it in court. They had drained their savings, begged, pleaded, and stood in front of the trucks. But the soldiers had come with rifles, pushing them back with the butts of their guns. Clara had been forced to watch as Solomon's crate was loaded onto a truck. He had roared for her, a sound of betrayal and confusion, until the truck disappeared into the dust. She had spent a decade looking for him, tracking paperwork through corrupt bureaucracies, until the trail went cold in a holding facility in Bulgaria. She had mourned him as if he were her child. She thought he had died in a cage, alone. And now, here he was, older, scarred, a king in exile. "You've grown so big," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "And you have a scar now. I have a few too." The spell was broken by the screech of tires on wet pavement. A black SUV skidded around the corner of the administration building, flanking the promenade. Mark Evans jumped out, followed by 3 members of the zoo's emergency response team. They weren't carrying tranquilizers. They were carrying heavy-caliber firearms, the kind used for lethal termination. The cold steel of the barrels gleamed in the harsh security lights that had flickered on. "Get away from the animal!" Evans screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He was breathless, his expensive shoes splashing in the puddles, his perfect hair ruined by the rain. "He's loose! The animal is loose!" Barnaby's head snapped toward the noise. The softness vanished from his eyes, his ears flattened, and he let out a snarl, turning his body to shield Clara, though Evans interpreted the movement as aggression toward her. "He's cornering her!" Evans yelled to the lead shooter, wiping rain from his eyes. "He's going to maul her! Take the shot! Take the shot now!" "No!" Clara's scream was shocking in its volume. It wasn't the voice of an old woman, it was the voice of a matriarch. She didn't step away from the lion, she stepped around him. She placed her body directly between the rifles and the lion's chest. "Don't you dare!" she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Evans. "He is not attacking! Put those guns down!" The lead shooter hesitated, lowering his barrel slightly. "Director, the civilian is in the line of fire. I can't take the shot." I might hit her. She's confused. She's in shock. Evans wiped the rain from his eyes, his face twisting in frustration. He looked around, seeing the phones recording in the distance. He needed to control the narrative. Move the woman, shoot the beast. If that lion hurts her, the lawsuit will bury us. Do it. You aren't trying to save me, Clara yelled back, her voice carrying over the wind. You're trying to bury your mistake. I saw the gate, Mr. Evans. I saw the rust. You cheap, arrogant man. Evans went pale. He realized instantly that the crowd was filming. Every word she said was being live-streamed to thousands. He couldn't let this narrative continue. He needed the lion dead, the story to be about a tragic, unavoidable accident, not a maintenance failure. Josh Reed came sprinting from the keeper quarters, his chest heaving, slipping on the wet grass. He saw the standoff, the old woman shielding the apex predator, the director screaming for blood. Stop! Josh dove toward the security team, grabbing the barrel of the nearest rifle and shoving it toward the ground. Are you crazy? You'll hit her! Get him off! Evans barked at the other guards. Reed, you're fired! Get out of here! Look at the lion! Josh screamed, ignoring his boss, ignoring the fact that his career was ending in that moment. He pointed at Barnaby. Look at him, Clara. He's not looking at the exit. He's not trying to leave the park. Clara, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, turned slightly to look at Solomon. Josh was right. The lion was agitated, shifting his weight, snarling at the guns. But his attention kept snapping back to the left, toward the veterinary complex. He was looking at the closed double doors of the clinic. He let out a moan, a high-pitched, desperate sound that was entirely unlike a roar. It was a sound of grief. It was the sound of a creature that knew loss. Clara's ethologist mind kicked into gear, overriding her fear. She looked at the clinic, then at the lion, then at Josh. She remembered the pacing, the contact calls. Why is he looking at the clinic, Josh? Clara demanded, her voice cutting through the rain. What is in there? Josh looked at Evans, then at the guns, then at the old woman who was risking her life. He made a choice. He broke the silence that Evans had bought with threats. It's Zara, Josh yelled, his voice breaking. His mate, the lioness. Evans lunged for Josh. Shut up, shut your mouth. Josh shoved Evans back, hard. She went into labor this morning. It went wrong. There were complications. We moved her to the clinic for an emergency C-section. Evans told us to keep it quiet in case the cubs died, so it wouldn't hurt the stock price. Barnaby has been calling to her all day. Clara turned back to Solomon. The pieces clicked into place. The pacing, the contact calling, the desperation. He hadn't broken out to hunt. He hadn't broken out to escape to the city. He had broken out because he could hear her. He could hear the distress calls of his mate. Sounds too low for human ears, but screamingly loud to him. He was a father trying to get to his dying family. He's not a monster, Clara said, her voice rising with a mix of fury and awe. He's a husband. She turned back to Evans, her face set in stone. He's trying to get to his mate. Let him pass. You're insane, Evans spat. He grabbed the rifle from the hesitated guard's hands. I am not letting a 500-pound killing machine walk into a medical facility. Move aside, Mrs. Jones. This ends now. Evans raised the rifle. He wasn't a marksman. His hands were shaking with adrenaline and rage. Barnaby saw the weapon rise. He knew what guns were. He remembered the poachers in the reserve before he was captured. He remembered the sound that killed his mother. The threat triggered a defensive rage. He roared, a sound that shook the rain from the air and coiled his muscles to spring. He was going to attack Evans. Solomon, no! Clara screamed. If he jumped, Evans would fire. At this range, Evans might miss the kill shot and maim him, leaving him to bleed out in agony. Or worse, the bullet would pass through the lion and hit the crowd behind. Clara did the only thing she could. She threw her arms around the lion's massive, wet mane. She buried her hands in the coarse fur, feeling the hard muscle beneath, and used her weight to guide him, not overpower him. She pressed her forehead against his, putting herself directly in his line of sight, blocking the view of the gun. It was a move of suicidal bravery. To grapple with an angry lion was to invite death. His teeth were inches from her throat. "Look at me," she commanded, her face inches from his snarling muzzle. "Solomon! Tazama hapa! Look here!" The use of Swahili, the language of his cubhood, pierced the red fog of his rage. Barnaby froze, his muscles trembling under her hands. He looked at her, confused, his breath hot on her face. "Stay," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "I have you. Stay." Evans didn't lower the gun. He saw the lion paused, a sitting duck. He saw a solution to all his problems. If the lion was dead, the danger was gone. He could spin the story later. "He's got her!" Evans yelled, lying through his teeth to justify the shot. "He's got her by the head!" "No, he doesn't!" Josh screamed, tackling Evans. But Evans's finger was already squeezing the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was deafening, a sharp slap against the eardrums that silenced the storm for a heartbeat. Clara flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the impact, waiting for the burn of the bullet or the weight of the dying lion collapsing onto her. She waited for the darkness to come, thinking of Arthur, thinking she would finally see him again. But the darkness didn't come. Instead, the large stone planter next to her, a heavy concrete urn filled with petunias, exploded. Concrete shards and wet earth sprayed outward like shrapnel. A jagged piece of stone sliced across Clara's cheek, drawing a line of bright red blood that mingled with the rain. Barnaby, terrified by the explosion next to his ear, reared up on his hind legs, his paws swiping at the air. He roared in pure panic, a sound of disorientation. He was a wild animal again, cornered and confused. Josh and Detective Miller, who had just arrived on the scene from the local station, had slammed Evans into the wet pavement, the rifle skittering away across the asphalt. Police officers swarmed the plaza, weapons drawn, shouting conflicting orders. "Target is agitated! Do not fire! The woman is too close! Get a clear line of sight!" The situation was spiraling. Barnaby was panicked, surrounded by shouting men, flashing lights, and the smell of gunpowder. He was seconds away from a rampage that would end with his death and likely the deaths of others. He spun in circles, snapping at the air, his eyes rolling back. "Solomon!" Clara's voice cut through the noise. It wasn't a scream this time, it was an anchor. She ignored the blood dripping down her chin. She ignored the pain in her hip that was now a screaming agony. She ignored the police shouting at her to get down. She began to hum. It was a deep, resonant melody. La la salama. La la salama. Sleep peacefully. She stepped toward the rearing lion. She didn't crouch. She stood tall, radiating a calm she didn't feel. She projected the authority of the matriarch. She channeled every ounce of love she had ever felt for the creatures of the earth. "Solomon, look at me. We are going to see Zara. Come." She turned her back on him. It was the ultimate sign of trust. She turned her defenseless back, her exposed neck, to a panicked predator. She began to walk toward the veterinary clinic. She walked with a severe limp, her cane left behind in the puddle. Every step was a battle against gravity and pain, but she kept her head high. She didn't look back. She kept humming, loudly, rhythmically, her voice weaving a protective circle around them. The police watched, stunned. Detective Miller held up a hand, signaling his team to hold fire. "Wait. Look. Just look." Barnaby stopped spinning. He watched the small figure moving away from him. The humming triggered a deeply ingrained neural pathway. a safety anchor from his earliest memories of milk and warmth. The scent of gunpowder faded, replaced by her scent. He dropped to all fours. He shook his mane, sending a spray of water outward like a halo. Then, with a low chuff, he trotted after her. He didn't run past her. He fell into step beside her. His massive shoulder brushed against her hip, offering support, steadying her. The crowd watched in tearful silence. It was a procession of two, an old woman with a bleeding face and a limp, and a 500-pound lion walking side by side through the scattering rain. It was a scene from a myth, something ancient and holy. Josh scrambled up from the ground, grabbing his keys, tears streaming down his face. "I'll open the door, I'm coming!" He sprinted ahead, fumbling with the keys, unlocking the clinic's double doors and holding them open wide. Clara walked through the threshold, Barnaby right at her heel. Inside, the clinic was warm and smelled of antiseptic and surgical steel. But beneath that, there was the smell of life. In the large recovery cage at the back of the room, Zara, the sleek lioness, lifted her head. She was groggy from the anesthesia, a bandage on her flank, but her eyes were bright. She let out a soft, welcoming moan. Curled against her belly were two tiny, spotted cubs, no bigger than house cats, mewling softly. Barnaby rushed to the cage. He didn't roar. He pressed his face against the mesh, inhaling the scent of his mate and his offspring. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his entire body deflating as the tension left him. He licked Zara's face through the wire, a tender, rough rasp of a tongue. She licked him back. He lay down in front of the cage, resting his chin on his paws, his eyes closing. He was guarding them. He was home. Clara stood watching them for a moment, her hand resting on the back of a chair to steady herself. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaking and cold. Her legs finally gave out. She sank into the chair, the room spinning slightly. Josh was there instantly, with a bottle of water and a first aid kit. He knelt beside her, dabbing at the cut on her cheek. "Clara! Clara! That was... I've never seen anything like that. In all my years." Clara took the water, her hands shaking so hard she spilled some on her cardigan. She drank deeply, the water tasting like life itself. She looked at Josh, her eyes bright and fierce behind her rain-spattered glasses. He just wanted to be a father, Josh. That's all. He was scared. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the rainy dusk. Detective Miller was reading Mark Evans his rights. The live stream from the crowd had done its work. The evidence of Evans's order to shoot, his admission of the broken gate, and his reckless endangerment of the public was already viral. The internet had judged him before the law even touched him. His career was over before he reached the squad car. Clara watched through the window as Evans was led away. She felt no triumph, only relief. She looked back at the lions, the family reunited. "I'm not invisible anymore, am I?" she whispered to herself. "No, ma'am," Josh said, overhearing her. He squeezed her hand. "You're the most visible person in the world right now." 3 months later, the autumn air was crisp and golden, a stark contrast to the humid storm of that July afternoon. The leaves on the oak trees had turned a brilliant russet and gold, drifting down to cover the paths. The sign at the entrance of the park had changed. It no longer read Oak Haven Zoological Gardens. It now read the Oak Haven Sanctuary and Conservation Center. The viral video, titled "A Massive Lion Broke Free at the Zoo." An elderly woman didn't run, shocking the crowd, had generated 50 million views in a week, but it had done more than entertain. It had mobilized. Donations poured in from around the world. A massive crowdfunding campaign had allowed the board of directors to oust the old management, restructure the organization as a nonprofit, and hire a new director of animal welfare. Clara Jones sat on the terrace of her new office, which overlooked the expanded lion habitat. The concrete pit was gone, demolished by bulldozers. In its place was a sprawling 3-acre enclosure with tall savanna grass, heated rocks, and a waterfall that fed into a clean pool. Clara wasn't wearing her old gray cardigan. She wore a functional khaki uniform with the sanctuary logo embroidered on the chest. She didn't look invisible anymore. She looked like a woman who had found her purpose, a woman who had come back to life. Down in the grass, Barnaby, now officially renamed Solomon on all the placards, was wrestling gently with one of his cubs. The cub, a feisty male, was swatting at Solomon's massive tail. Solomon feigned defeat, flopping onto his back, allowing the cub to conquer him. Zara lay nearby on a sun-warmed rock, watching them with lazy contentment, her scar healed. Josh Reed, now the headkeeper, walked onto the terrace, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He looked rested, the shadows under his eyes gone, his step light. "The structural engineers just finished the inspection on the new perimeter fencing," Josh said, setting the tea down on the small table. "It's bomb-proof. Double redundant hydraulics, manual overrides, the works. And the new veterinary wing breaks ground next week." "Good," Clara said, taking the tea and warming her hands on the mug. "And the legal team?" "Evans pleaded guilty to negligence and endangerment. He's looking at heavy fines and community service, and he's barred from ever holding a position in animal management again. He's finished." Clara nodded, sipping her tea. "Justice is a slow creature, Josh, but it eventually arrives. Like a tortoise." She stood up, picking up her cane. A new one, hand-carved from African blackwood, a gift from the staff. She walked to the heavy glass viewing pane that separated the office terrace from the habitat. Down below, Solomon paused his play. He looked up, spotting her instantly. He trotted up the hill, abandoning the cub. He moved with a regal grace, his mane full and dark. He came right up to the glass. He was magnificent. Healthy, his coat shining, the stress of the old concrete cage gone. He pressed his massive forehead against the glass. Clara raised her hand. She pressed her palm against the glass, directly over his nose. She could feel the warmth of his breath through the thick pane. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to hum. The connection was absolute, a silent language of love and respect that transcended species, time, and distance. On her desk, behind her, sat a framed photograph. It was a split image. On the left was a grainy, color-faded photo of a middle-aged woman in Kenya, bottle-feeding a scrawny cub under an acacia tree. On the right was a high-definition photo taken by a news crew 3 months ago. An old woman leading a massive lion through the rain, her hand guiding him, his head bowed in trust, the crowd parting around them like the Red Sea. Clara whispered to the glass, a smile touching her lips for the first time in years that reached all the way to her eyes. "You're a good boy, Solomon. You protected your family." Solomon let out a soft chuff, fogging the glass, then turned and trotted back down the hill to his cubs. Clara watched him go. She wasn't waiting for the silence to swallow her anymore. She wasn't waiting to die. She had a sanctuary to run. She had a family to protect. She took a sip of tea, watched the leaves fall, and for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to tomorrow. If this powerful story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another epic tale of courage, adventure, and the extraordinary world of lions. Share this video with a friend who would love this story.